Today on the Perception and Action podcast, how do we use information from our environment to select between different opportunities for action? How do we pick up this information? A look at exploratory head movements in team sports and the affordance competition hypothesis. So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I want to examine the issue of action selection and how we use exploratory search behavior to guide this process. At any moment, we are faced with two fundamental problems to solve from a perceptual motor control perspective: selection between actions that are currently possible, and specifications of the parameters or metrics for these actions. I've focused on the issue of action specification, that is how we use information to guide our actions, a lot in the podcast already. So today I want to turn to the issue of action selection, starting with an example of research in this area and moving to a theory and model of this process. So here we go. A good example of the challenging problem of action selection can be seen by looking at midfielder play in soccer. Depending on the game situation, when the player receives a pass, there could be many different possible actions to choose from. Pass, with a few different options to different players, dribble into space, or shoot. How does the player know which of these opportunities for action is available in any given moment and select between them? The first thing we do know about this behavior is that to do it effectively at a high level of competition, it must be done prospectively. That is, the player must have already begun the process of action selection before they receive the ball. This is reflected in the common coaching instructions: don't turn blind or check your shoulder. Skilled soccer players engage in visual exploratory actions in which they move their body, head, and eyes to visually perceive the game around them. In doing so, the player is able to perceive the availability of space and other players, which provides information about the opportunities to act, or the affordances. Visual exploratory actions in soccer have been investigated in a really nice series of studies by Geert Jordet, Geert van Pepping, and colleagues. The first basic findings that came from their research is that an increase in a player's exploratory action prior to receiving the ball, expressed as a higher frequency of head movements, results in improved performance with the ball. These improvements include faster subsequent passes, more turns with the ball, and more forward passes, and a higher likelihood of playing a successful pass. To see this in a little more detail, let's look at a study by McGucklin and colleagues from 2018. In this study, the authors sought to expand on their previous work by looking at both the frequency and extent of head movements before gaining possession of the ball. They also examined how this behavior changed as a function of the time between receiving the ball, starting at a point 10 seconds before reception and moving in 1 second intervals. It was predicted that increased head turn frequency and head turn excursion before gaining possession of the ball would result in a higher likelihood of successful actions with the ball. It was further expected that the exploratory head movement performed closer to the time of ball reception would be more closely associated with on-ball performance than head movements that occurred earlier. This latter prediction was made because of the ever-changing dynamic nature of affordances. Due to the movement of other players, the opportunities available for actions 10 seconds before receiving the ball are likely to be quite different from those available 1 second before. The study involved 32 players from the Australian National Premier Leagues. Players wore 9 degree of freedom inertial measurement units, or IMUs, mounted in headbands while playing an 11-on-11 match. Data from the IMUs was used to calculate head turn frequency and head turn excursion in 1 second intervals. Videos of the gameplay were scored by 2 raters in terms of performance with the ball, for example, pass accuracy. What was found? As participants came closer to receiving the ball, the average frequency and extent of head turns became significantly greater. However, in this study, there was no relationship to the accuracy or success of subsequent passes. For me, the most interesting finding was that a higher than average head turn frequency and head turn excursion before receiving the ball resulted in a higher likelihood of turning with the ball, playing a pass in the attacking direction, and playing a pass to an area that was opposite to which it was received from. So in other words, when players explored their environment more, they used more complex action opportunities afforded by the surrounding environment. This is consistent with the idea that exploration reveals affordances and is an excellent example of action supporting perception. In a paper published by Van Andel and colleagues in 2019, this group of researchers sought to situate these findings more directly within an ecological psychology framework, specifically relating it to Lee's Tau guidance hypothesis, which I discussed back in episode 126. In their paper, the authors proposed a new terminology, exploration for action orientation, which is essentially seeking out information from one's environment to identify affordances. The central idea is that an organism first needs to orient themselves toward what actions are available in the environment before deciding what action to perform. They again use soccer as a specific example. Quote, imagine, for instance, in an evasion sport such as basketball or soccer, a player in the midfield court is surrounded by both opponents as well as teammates. Before they gain possession of the ball, exploration for orientation is imperative to determine where the ball could come from, where free space exists, where opponents and team players are, and where the ball could be passed to once possession is gained. Yet when the player receives the ball and needs to guide their actions to deliver an accurate pass, exploration for action specification is used to collect the required perceptual information to specify, for instance, how much force is required for the pass. Similarly, in any situation where individuals are fully surrounded by action opportunities, exploration in support of the discovery of response alternatives, i.e. exploration for orientation, is imperative, and together, both types of exploration are centrally important in determining adequate decision-making and skill execution for the player. End quote. As I mentioned, to expand on their previous research, the authors analyzed head movements made by soccer players receiving a pass using the Tau guide theory. To refresh your memory, in this theory, actions are controlled based on the rate of closure of the gap between the current state and a goal state, which forms a Tau-like variable. So in the soccer example investigated in this study, we can think of it as the rate of closure of the gap between the current position of the player's head and the position they're trying to get to pick up information. In analyzing behavior in this way, there are two aspects we can look at. First, the duration of coupling. That is, how much of the execution of the movement seems to be coupled to the Tau guide information. Second, the dynamics of the closure of the gap. Is it a soft closure, so that the head is decelerating and stops moving when we reach the goal state, what we would expect if we want to look at something there? Or is it a hard closure, so that the head is still accelerating when it reaches the goal state, what we might expect when a player was heading the ball, for example? The authors hypothesized that these two coupling characteristics should be different for exploration for action orientation and controlling the action itself, that is, action specification. Quote, when one starts exploring for action orientation, it is still unknown where the potential end target is in the surrounding environment. It is therefore likely that the exploration for action orientation is characterized by 1. Shorter duration perceptual motor coupling, only for the latter part of the movement when a visual target is identified, and 2. A stronger deceleration of the head to provide final stability for successful fixation. Conversely, after orientation, once the animal is aware of the location of a visual end target and is in need of exploration for action specification, we hypothesize that the movement will be characterized by 1. Longer duration perceptual motor coupling, and 2. As errors in action specification might influence the performance of the following movement, and performers were seeking to avoid overshooting, we expect to find earlier velocity peaks and smoother decelerations in exploration for action specification. End quote. To investigate this, the authors brought the task into the lab and created a simulated soccer passing scenario. 16 active players from Australian semi-pro leagues were presented with a task that involves standing in front of 5 computer monitors arranged in a semicircle. The main screen positioned in front of the participant showed a video of a teammate passing them the ball. The 4 surrounding screens presented one of 4 situations: open space, a free teammate, or an opponent or a marked teammate. Cones were positioned on the ground in front of these screens. A kick of one of the cones represented one of the 4 response options. After they received the virtual pass, participants were instructed to kick the cone corresponding to where they would play the ball. IMUs mounted in the headbands were again used to measure head movements. The main variables of interest were the coupling value, which represents the type of contact, hard or soft, and the proportion of the head movement which was coupled to the tau value. What was found? On average, participants performed 3.5 head movements before ball possession per trial. In terms of the tau guidance characteristics, results were somewhat supportive of the author's hypotheses. First, there was a trend for a lower percentage of coupling as orientation commenced. Second, there was an increase in the number of head movements with soft contact, that is, gradual deceleration in the final phase of movement, as the time became closer to ball reception. So in sum, this study does provide some evidence that the movement guidance characteristics vary between different head turns as participants move from exploration for orientation to exploration for action specification. The first head turn in the trial used for action orientation showed later peaks in velocity profile and harder closure of the movement gap in comparison to later head turns. Again, I think these are excellent examples of the reciprocal nature between perception and action. We not only use information to move, we move to acquire information. And how we do this depends on our goal: action selection versus specification. The last paper I want to look at today is a theoretical one published by Sisek in 2007. Mirroring what I've been talking about so far in today's episode, Sisek was concerned with the problems of action selection and action specification. As he points out nicely, traditional cognitive theories propose that these two functions are completed in a serial manner, so that we select what to do before specifying how to do it. According to this view, the perceptual system first collects sensory information to build an internal descriptive representation of objects in the external world. Next, this information is used along with representation of current goals and memories of past experience to make judgments and decide upon a course of action. The resulting plan is then used to generate a desired trajectory for movement, or a motor program or plan, which is finally realized through the motor system. In other words, the brain first builds knowledge about the world using representations which are independent of actions. And this knowledge is later used to make decisions, compute an action plan, and finally execute a movement. An example of this type of approach is the recognition prime decision-making model, which I discussed back in episode 143. However, in his paper, Sisek argues that the serial description of this process does not seem to fit with how our environment works. Quote, "Continuous interaction with the world often does not allow one to stop and think or to collect information and build a complete knowledge of one's surroundings. To survive in a hostile environment, one must be ready to act on a short notice, releasing into execution actions that are at least partially prepared. These are the fundamental demands which shape brain evolution. They motivate animals to process sensory information in an action-dependent manner to build representations of the potential actions which the environment currently affords. In other words, the perception of a given natural setting may involve not only representations which capture information about the identity of objects in the setting, but also representations which specify the parameters of possible actions that can be taken. With a set of such potential actions partially specified, the animal is ready to quickly perform actions if circumstances demand. In essence, it's possible that the nervous system addresses a question of specification, how to do it, before performing selection, what to do. Indeed, for continuous interactive behavior, it may be best to perform both specification and selection processes at all times to enable continuous adjustment to the changing world." End quote. In the paper, Sisek formalizes this proposed simultaneous process of action selection and action specification in what he calls the affordance competition hypothesis. The essential idea is that the sensory information arriving from the world is continuously used to specify several currently available potential actions, while other kinds of information are collected to select from among these the one that will be executed at a given moment. From this perspective, behavior is viewed as a constant competition between internal representations of potential actions. He then goes on to develop a specific neurophysiological model of this process using evidence from neuroscience research. If you're interested in more details, please check out the paper. But the main point I want to make here is that there is evidence to support the idea that our brain is doing this type of action selection and action specification processes I've been discussing today. So to sum up, in today's episode, I looked at the process of exploring one's environment for action selection. For me, one of the big questions that remains is, what do we do with this affordance information? When a soccer player moves their head around and identifies a pass to the left, a forward run, or a shot as possible action options, what do they do with this information? In Sisek's model, these affordances are stored as representations, which for me is not a really satisfying idea because it does not fit with a direct ecological approach to perception action. A better approach for me is if we use this information about available affordances to establish calibration states and build what are commonly called soft assemblies. Thus, the purpose of exploring is to set up the dynamics of action specification, not store representations for possible actions. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive some materials including podcast transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.